You can buy it yourself and tell me if it lost all its taste. So again tonight, we're kind of spilling over on so it's going to be vegetable options, but it's going to be more tonight about a little review, talk about climate and microclimate, climate change. Even I'm going to mention. I don't have a slide on it, but when I'm talking about climate, we have to realize that we have shifted in the last 30 years to being a little bit more warm and more rainfall, and so that's why having a good garden location and planting strategy is important. And so on review, I just want you to remember that why pH is so important is because it drives chemical reactions in the soil that will make some nutrients more available or less available depending on where the pH is. So this is the zone that most of our garden plants like. It's rare to have like the blueberry that likes it clear over here. Having the proper pH of slightly acid is the way that we get the nutrients in the soil readily available to our plants. And if you remember, there's one that's a problem in Marshall County, that's magnesium. Because we tend to be neutral, and it is more available in the acidic situation. Sometimes this micronutrient's a problem, can be. It's one to watch out for. And iron sometimes can be one as well. So when we do a soil test, sometimes people run the micronutrients just to see if anything's out of whack in micronutrients. Just remember, the micronutrient soil tests are not as accurate as the macronutrients. So these tests for the macronutrients are more accurate in telling us where it's at. And then, we always want to keep potassium and manganese in the right range because they're competing for the plant uptake because the soil holds on to it. Remember, I said the soil is charged, right? Remember that comment I made last week? So these both are cations in the soil. So ideally, we kind of want this around 5, and it's more like around 15. So if you look over here, see the magnesium's low, and this is like an indication just looking at this. But this level over here, and then potassium's low, which makes, or medium to low. We would want to fertilize with those. Now, what is odd is sometimes potassium or magnesium can be medium, and if the other one's high or very high, we'll still fertilize with that other fertilizer, so it's more available in the soil. So if you get a soil test, I'll walk you through it, to understand it. That's a service my office does, so we can help you out that way. Because you didn't understand anything I just said, did you? Raise your hand if it makes sense. So, and then we always like to have the organic matter fairly high, because we talked about that last week, because that is adding holding sites in your soil for nutrients and water, and it's allowing the soil to have better structure. And just remember, when you're, if I tell you you need to apply a half a pound of nitrogen per 100 square foot for a vegetable plant, we have to remember when we buy our nitrogen, the first number is a % by weight basis. So if you need a half of a pound to get that, you would need 5 pounds of this to have a half of a pound, because it's 10% of whatever the weight of the fertilizer is. It's nitrogen in this case. Does that make sense? That's how we read the fertilizer label. So in this bag, there's 5 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer. Because it weighs 50 pounds and times 10%, means 5 pounds is in this bag. So you got to do math, when you are doing a fertilizer application. So I didn't start with this, but let's have the fun. Why do you want to be a gardener? Does anyone have, why do you garden? Why do you grow your own vegetables?
Tastes good.
Tastes good.
It's like the challenge, you know?
The challenge of seeing if you can do it and get a plant to produce some produce. You know, so you have a selection of plants that you can grow. So you can have the cultivar that you like. You go to the grocery store, you have a limited selection of cultivars that you can buy. Farmers market is better because they'll grow some different types of cultivars. I mean, 4th of July tomato, I have never seen it in a grocery store, and it's a smaller tomato and has great flavor. And the only way you're going to have a 4th of July tomato is if you grow it yourself or go to a farmer's market, which is where I bought it from Janice Herford. And that's a cultivar. So you get a bigger selection of what you can have. You get exercise. And I know someone that was a eye doctor. Actually, he did procedures for cataract surgery and stuff. So he had kind of an intense job during the day, and he'd have this property where he could come home and garden at night and have lights because it'd be dark a lot of times when he got home. Because that just would be a stress relief for him and let him calm down. So gardening can be very therapeutic for people as well. You determine, you know, what pesticides are used on your vegetable plants. You determine if it's used at all. Are you an organic gardener? But you will know what is done to that vegetable plant. And that can be a value to people. And that's why people like to go to the farmers markets as well, because they can talk to the person that grew it and learn what they did. You know, I always say if you shop at the farmers market, you should be your own food inspector. You should be asking those kind of questions and have an interaction with the grower. That's the value of buying at the farmers market. Hopefully it's fun, meaning that you have the time to do it and you can do it in a relaxed manner and you don't feel stressed when you're growing your vegetables. Already talked about variety differences. Can you save money? Do you agree? That's questionable, you know. But if you build your soil, like I was talking about last week, and you actually put in amendments to build that soil so it has a higher organic matter and it has that ability to give back nutrients to your plants, and you don't have to do a lot of preparation time. Because if you actually build high quality garden space soil, eventually you may not even need to till it. You know, you'll be able to work the plant into that soil that has all that rich texture, and you just don't want to compact it. And then it's going to be a source of nutrients to help them to be productive, to augment whatever fertility program you utilize. So soil health is great for vegetable plants. Soil health is great for the health of the vegetable plant. Remember me saying that? So as we get there, if you go from a soil that has good active organic matter in it, it shifts the microorganisms that live in the soil to a profile that's healthy for the plant. So you're going to have less issues with diseases that attack the roots in that plant that's growing there. So you have more success. So we're going to talk a little bit about climate. So the temperature and the rainfall. If you live in UP, Michigan, the part of Michigan we always forget about because it's not part of the menu. They have to have high tunnels to grow tomatoes at all. The growing season is so short that they cannot grow tomatoes outside. So if you get in a climate, you may not be able to plant some summer-loving vegetables outside. You may need to augment or extend the season and even grow. So they can determine the crops we can raise, the timing of planting. You know, so we want to make sure they don't get frosted if they're a tender vegetable. The planting method, and what I mean by that is how many of you like gourds? Our season is almost too short to plant them by seed. We need to start them and plant a transplant if we want to have a full season where the gourds can harden off and be mature to be harvested. So ideally, if you're planting gourds, you don't plant a seed. You make sure you have a long enough growing season. You plant a transplant when you can and by our weather. So some of our things we want to grow, it's better to use transplants because our growing season might not be long enough. Ability to do succession planting, the longer our growing season is, the more advantage we can take advantage of that. And the amount of supplemental water we needed is all climate related. We're blessed. We have more rainfall today than we used to. When I was 18 years old, we had 4 less annual inches of rain during the growing season. So that's what has happened in our shift in climate.
Trouble is, it doesn't come at all anymore from about the middle of July till the beginning of August.
It's always been the problem.
As it,
My crops course I took at Purdue, the professor in the class says, so our rainfall pattern, our climate is totally opposite of what we want. When we want to plant, it's wet. When we want to grow, it's dry. And when we want to harvest, it's wet. That's just the nature. And actually that holds out when you look at what the monthly average of rainfall is. It just fits into that pattern. And you have to remember in the summer months, you may get about the same amount of rainfall that we have evaporation that just takes it out of the soil. So like in August of last year, it was not only less rainfall than other months, it was really hot. So that put a lot of stress on our plant. So we want to be able to locate where we can irrigate or supplement our watering for our vegetable plants without carrying 5-gallon buckets. I would not recommend that being our way of getting the water to our garden area. Unless you want to build muscles. I mean, if you want a real workout, you can do it that way. Then when we're thinking of our microclimate, again, we talk about your soil type. That's going to have a big impact on your microclimate in your landscape, the water and nutrient holding capacity of that soil. If we have that Chelsea sand, which is this pure sand, it has very little holding capacity of anything. So that's going to dictate how we manage our vegetable crop, because we're going to have to spoon feed it fertility, because it's all going to go in the soil solution. Remember me talking about how I killed those weed garden, because I didn't take that into account, because I had my Napanee loam soil I grew up on, and I didn't take into account as pretty much below sand where they were planted. And then, so then how much organic matter, and this is what we can change. So it's exciting as a gardener, and the drainage is really important, because if we're getting more rainfall and we have poor drainage where we're trying to plant a garden, we're going to be planting it late each spring. So we want to create good drainage or have good drainage. And then we'll always want to consider depth to water table, because like I talked about, the water table can be very high in our soil profile. So if we really don't want to have our garden space right there. We want it to where we have some good drainage. And then we would think about our local topography. We don't want to plant in the low areas because of frost issues that we can get into in those lower areas in our landscape. And in most landscape, you're not going to have enough difference to make a difference, but it's better to have it on a higher side where you just naturally have better drainage. And then our soil fertility, if we have organic soil, it's going to come with a lot of soil fertility. If we have that Chelsea sand, it's not going to have a lot, so we have to augment it. Critical that you have full sun for vegetable plants. They like sun. But you need at least 60% full sun at the site that you're going to garden in. Does that make sense? All right, talk about access to water. Size of your garden will determine what you can grow to. So if you have a smaller garden, you're going to do more things like what we have here, chard or lettuce. We're not going to be growing a lot of sweet corn if we don't have space. And then what's nice is to rotate crops. And I'll talk about that later on when I talk about families of vegetables and how we manage them. And then other considerations. What are your considerations? I guess that's where I ask you a question. So you say, do some interaction. What are the considerations that I have in my microclimate I need to be worried about putting a garden in my yard?
I've been reading about trying to grow things vertically on trellises and such, and use more space and grow things vertically so that you don't take so much area. What are your ideas for that coming up later?
I'm going to address on that because when we talk about some intensive gardening, and that's how you can do intensive gardening. And partly is by doing the vertical gardening. But what's really neat is you can actually grow plants, and I don't have this in my presentation, on the side of a wall. You just have to have a box, and that's true vertical gardening, and then you put soil into plastic, and you just poke holes in it to put your plants in, and you can have your strawberry bed on the side of a shed versus on the ground. So if you have limited space, as long as that's getting sun at that location, you can do stuff like that, and you can do herbs like that. So you can do true vertical gardening. We're not even using your soil. You're just taking advantage of a space in your landscape that you can do that. And if you've ever gone to Chicago Botanical Gardens, they have different plants that they plant in that way. So they just make a big box and they make it so you can put a plastic liner in and hold the soil in, and you just poke in where you want your plants to grow in that vertical garden. So that's true vertical gardening.
What do you think of square foot gardening? Because I've heard different people do that. I've never done it, but.
I'm going to talk kind of about that. It's in my presentation tonight.
All right.
So I'm going to talk about different gardening methods tonight and some discussions about preparation, but so if you have limited space and yeah, I don't need to do the presentation, it is tonight. But so first of all, we want to know our overall climate. And so really Mother's Day typically is when we will get our last frost is by Mother's Day. There's only a 10% chance it's going to be later. So if you're planting tender vegetables, you want to wait until Mother's Day to plant them. Or you can do the vendors a great service and buy them on that nice, beautiful, warm day in mid-April and plant them there. And then you get to buy them again in mid-May. I mean, but you're helping the economy, so don't feel guilty for doing that. It's a good thing. And then we have to think when we're extending our growing season, and we talked more about fall gardening in the last session, but we also need to know when the last frost is. And for most of Marshall County, that's September 28th to the 4th. So usually our by a 10% chance, our first frost comes after October. A lot of times, it seems like it usually doesn't come until mid-October or early November. And so you usually can extend your growing season, partly into October or most of October, if you can protect your plants from that one minor frost that may happen before the end of October. So we always want to think about how can I keep my tomatoes growing? And remember that when they're close to being ripe, they'll finish maturing inside. So don't lose tomatoes to the frost because you don't pick them inside and let them finish out. And then on this one, I was going to talk about, so the two changes we've had in the last, every 30 years, they change our averages. So we've got more rainfall and warmer now with our climate. And what we're noticing, and we saw it last season, we had a wet spring, then we had almost a droughty August. So we usually have weather come in more intense manners. So think about that, where you place your garden and how you manage it. So you want to have really good drainage, created or naturally, so you can garden early. And then you want to be able to get the plants through a dry, warm period. And don't believe that those two maps. Check the local weather before you make decisions. Like whoever thought, it's going to be 85 degrees. I was sweating outside because of how warm and the humidity is going up. So check the local weather so you know what's going to happen. So this week we know it's going to be a very warm summer-like weather. They're debating whether we're going to maybe hit 90 or not, because that hardly ever happens in May. Hopefully it won't here. But then you look at this 30-day outlook. This was done on April the 30th. And what does these white areas mean? That Indiana's in both areas. They don't know. It's a gamble. So the meteorologists, they have 9 models they look at to predict weather. And if it's equal chance, that means there's so much confusion in those 9 models, they throw up their hands and say equal chance. We don't know what's going to happen. So long-term outlooks are not very good when you're considering, and even when it's colored lightly, it's just leaning toward being above moisture in this light green. This light blue, it's just leaning towards being cooler than normal, you know. So when there's dark colors, that's a strong indication they think what they know what's going to happen in those areas. A 6 to 10 day outlook, again, we're near normal on precipitation and on temperature for our Indiana. So it looks like we're going to have a period where we're not going to have too much moisture. And, you know, if I had the nearby, we'd be way above normal this week. So we've got a window here where we can get our gardens planted. So if you have a garden to plant, this is the time to do it when we have we're going to have a little bit better conditions. Because you look at 8 to 14 days out, and let's be honest, they're still guessing. Anything more than a week out, Mike Hoffman, you remember him as our meteorologist, that he's retired now, but they make him do a 14-day weather outlook. He says, I didn't like doing it because you get beyond 7 days, they're just kind of guessing because they really don't know what's going to happen. But 8 to 14 days, it doesn't, you know, there's a chance we're leaning towards above normal moisture 8 to 14 days out. And then we're leaning towards maybe below normal. So I would take advantage of the opportunity you have now for what you need to plant. And there's no indication we're going to have a frost situation in the near future. So you can start planting those potato vegetables and feel good about it. Not thinking you're going to have to buy new ones. So again, things to remember when we're selecting our garden space. We want full sun, we want well-drained soil. We wanted to keep it away from trees and shrubs because of shade and water. Tree roots will pull out water from underneath your garden space if you're in their zone where there's a lot of tree roots. And also, if you're digging down in the soil, you're going to be hitting tree roots. So that's not fun either. So you want to stay away from trees as much as you can. And you don't want to have to carry 5-gallon buckets from your neighbor's spigot or something to get water to your garden. So you want it close to where you have a hose that you can use to hook up some sucker hoses or irrigation water if we're getting extreme warm. And we want it to be reasonably level and avoid a low spot again if it's significantly different in your landscape. It makes a big difference where my garden is compared to where Sam Irwin's blueberries grow, because it's extreme elevation differences. So sometimes my fruit plants don't get frosted, but his does because that's a major difference. Minor differences is more of a drainage issue. You want to make sure those lower areas aren't wet. It's just a minor change. So if we have the sweet corn here and shorter plants here, this must either be east-west directions. This is definitely not the north because you wouldn't want to plant the corn where it's going to shade the shorter vegetables, right? So it could work if it's east-west or if this is north on that side. But you want to think about when you're planting your garden that you're not shading plants unless you want to shade them. So we can create our soil. We can amend our soil. You know, so the quickest way to get a better soil that's highly functioning is that we amend it and make a raised bed where we're adding organic matter to the soil and working it in. So you're changing what's there instead of just growing cover crops and letting it happen slowly. The cover crops will help, but if we work some amendment into our garden space, we can do that quicker. We can even change our pH if you want to reduce the pH level. I've got samples of soils that were in the high 7s, and I don't think they really did much. I've had some in the 8s, but they did things like adding wood ash to their gardens. Wood ash is a great lining agent. It has some nutrients in it, but if you intensively add it to one spot, you get pHs in the 8s. So sometimes we want to, if you want to lower your pH, you can use peat moss or something that is acidic as a organic matter to add to your soil to make your raised bed as an amendment. Or you can use compost that we should be creating. It's not hard to do compost. I just need the right items to put in it. So in the fall, save back some leaves or grind them and start, like I was talking about, started them composting. Then you can add some green stuff to it when you get into the growing season to get a better mixture of nutrients in it and it broken down further. So the advantage of a raised bed is that it warms up quicker in the spring. You're creating not only drainage, but having a higher soil profile. When it does warm up, it'll heat up quicker in that raised bed. Of course, improved water drainage. So if you're having issues with that, doing a raised bed makes a lot of sense. And then as we age, sometimes we'll talk more about that not next week, but the week after on creating real raised beds so that we don't have to bend over. So as we age, bending over gets more difficult. My father-in-law now has to put, they keep telling him to do this, on the end of his putter, put a suction cup to get the ball out of the cup, because bending over to get the ball out of the cup is hard for him to do that. So we have to adjust how we do things based upon our physical activity and our health. Any questions about what I've talked about? Did you know that we're getting warmer now? I mean, I used to live in Napanee and thought it was cool in 1978 when we got the blizzard because I was still in high school, so I got out of high school for 2 weeks. But then when I was managing my dad's farm in the early 80s, we had snow every winter from November until end of April. I mean, so if you have gray hair and you lived in this area, you know that back then it was colder and winters were harsher. And, so we don't have those kind of winters now. So it only makes sense that our climate is as warm. And so we have to take an account.
Hey, Bob, when going over your microclimate for your garden, would it be helpful to know the beneficial pests within your garden?
Beneficial pests?
Yes.
I mean, the insects are beneficial insects.
Insects, maybe even like weeds that might help.
Yeah, we can talk about that. I mean, you know what Japanese beetle loves, his favorite plant ever? Smartweed. So if you have smartweed growing close to your garden space, they're going to eat that natural vegetable. They love that. So we have, and I'll talk a little bit about that, not a lot of detail, but there are plants that are trap crops, we call them, where the pests prefer them over the what you're growing. So it's a good thing to have. And then we do have beneficial insects that I'll show you in canyon planting. That's why we have flowers. Flowers helps attract them. Well, I'm going to talk about potatoes tonight, but the best way to control the catarrhinic beetle by research is using straw mulch, and it'll help attract beneficial insects that feed upon those larvae when they're small. So, and then in canyon planting, we even attract them more by having flowers and crop diversity. In my slide, I will show all the fabulous information on how we can control calorie yet, but we'll talk about it. So then, you want to think about the growing season and how we plan where we're going to plant stuff. And productive garden, we're going to utilize the springtime to get some cool season vegetables growing and then transition it to either a fall or summer garden. So that's succession planting where we use the same garden space twice in one growing season. We can do some of that. You don't have to do all of it that way, but that's something we can do, intensive gardening, to get more output out of our garden space. So on paper, they're just talking about years, but what you want to think about is planting your garden, we're too late. It's time to go to action. This is what gardeners do in the winter time. You think of your garden space, you think about the cultivars you want to plant, and you think about succession planting or relay planting that you want to do within your garden space. Then you think about rotating plants to a new area. And for some, I do, but if you have limited space, it's still good to plant nightshade plants in different locations that are here. You know, and we're gonna talk about that here in a second. So we need a plan, not only this year, but how we're gonna move stuff around in upcoming years, to make sense. And then within the year, you want to think if you're gonna grow more than one vegetable in one space. So we want to think that through, back there in January when we think summer is never going to come again. Actually, I agree with the meteorologist. I watched Channel 8 on 46, and she said that's really towards the end of February when we think summer is never going to come, and I agree with her. I mean, you expect January to be cold. By the time you get to February, you think, I'm ready for this to be over. So how do you make yourself happy? This. You plant your garden, you go through garden catalogs, you look for a new vegetable you may want to try. And you're doing all that in February when you're just tired of winter. The summer is going to come. So we've got, you know, a lot of varieties that we can get through online catalogs or mail order. You can learn about different cultivars through Purdue's and other institutions' research, because our horticulture specialist is going to do, she does variety trials of different vegetables every year at the Penny Purdue farm. And then we have one in southern Indiana at the Southwest farm that does the same thing, where they plant different cultivars of pumpkins and stuff, and they determine which ones are problematic, which ones going to get more diseases, which ones produce a better fruit or vegetable. And so you can glean a lot of information off of us. And it's just not Purdue. If you look at other universities in our same zone, growing conditions, you can take advantage of their research, like Missouri and New York, and Pennsylvania. So their data would apply to us for the most part. Then we have All American Selections, and they put out new cultivars every year. And these are gardens that are located throughout the United States, where they grow the same cultivar in all those locations and trying to find the ones that work the best in most locations. So the ones they highlight for new releases are new vegetable cultivars that perform well in many locations. So you can have confidence they'll do well in your location. So that's another source of information. And the National Garden Bureau has a lot of data as well. But don't forget your local garden centers. If you have a garden center where there's someone that's knowledgeable that can tell you about the seeds, like Cashin Creek or that, she has a real nice selection of seeds that you can get from her, and she's knowledgeable, so where she can actually talk about it. If you go to a box store, read the packet. Because they may have, I mean, we had one at the South Bend Lowe's when she's retired now, but she was a master gardener and she knew a lot of information, so she could answer your questions. But that's not always the case at a garden center as part of large stores. But you'll get, you know, information that on the front side about, you know, where they're coming from, the pea cultivar. And then on the back side, it'll give you a lot of information like days to harvest, 65 days for this sweet corn. It'll tell you how big of an area. This will plant a 75-foot row of sweet corn. It gives you the spacing information, depth to plant. You always want to plant sweet corn about 1.5 inches. And that's due to how the root system it gets established on corn plants. You want it at 1.5 inches deep because you want the first set of roots to be down in the soil that deep. And then tells you days to germination. Tells you when to plant in the zone that's on your packet. So May to July. And why we can go into July, because it's a 65-day cultivar. So that's a pretty quick cultivar for a sweet corn variety. So that's why it can go a little bit later. A lot of longer cultivars we want planted by June. So it just depends, in this case, the cultivar tells us that. Does that make sense? So read up and know what you're supposed to do. Because the spacing is critical that we don't create a weed situation by the plants that we plant. If we plant them too close together, they're competing, and they're not going to get the nutrients and moisture that they need. So we want proper spacing.
How important is the expiration date on the seed?
That one you wouldn't buy. Sweet corn doesn't last very long. That's actually an old pack I had in my office. I took a picture of it. It says the 13. So, if you looked at the expiration date, it says 12/13, you throw it in the trash. Sweet corn's good for maybe 2 years, in good storage conditions. So anything, and what you're buying in a store, you want it to say this year. So it's very important to make sure that it's not an old seed. You know, if you have old seed that you got, you always can do a germ test to see if anything germinates. And that's just putting it between, you just get some paper towel, moisten it, and put the seed in between it, roll it up, and just put it in a container and just wait, see if it germinates. And if it takes in enough moisture, that's what will trigger it to germinate. That's why you need moist paper towel. You know, it will germinate within 7 to 10 days, according to this. And we're going to do a worm germ test. We're not going to put it out at 55 degrees. We leave it in our house where it's 70 degrees so that we can test the seeds. So if you save seed back, I had a gardener in southern Indiana that actually developed his own cultivar of tomatoes. So he always saved the seeds back. So to make sure they're viable seeds, you always can do a test and put them into that worm germ test and moist paper towel and see what percent germinates.
So you can't actually plant things closer together thinking I'll fertilize them a little more and water them a little more. That's not a good idea.
Well, it's the light and the space the plant physically needs is what determines the space. Not just the nutrients. You know, so we want to make sure that each plant's got enough space for it to get the size it needs to be, because it's not just moisture, it's just not nutrients, it's the sun. So we want to make sure that it's good sun. So, you know, this one's saying, you know, plant 20 inches apart. You probably could cheat that a little bit, 20 inches, but the researcher at Michigan State, okay, for people that know what we plant field corn at, he's planting sweet corn at 40,000 populations, and even did some at 60,000 populations per acre. That's pretty close together. And he was getting good yields by doing that, by doing what you're saying, making sure they have adequate shielding and water. But as a gardener, you don't want to push the envelope. You just want to have a good year to harvest. So you want to just be, and I've got a handout where we talk about just band planting, where we're trying to get close together, how much space different vegetables need. So we want to give them at least the space that they need. So this is a band planting, some where we're trying to be more intensive and not having rows that we till in between each row of our vegetables. But you got to think about some cultivars, some vegetables we grow. What's the biggest issue with tomatoes? Disease. You know, there's a disease for every season of the tomato. You know, so there's a disease that can get on at any time. So instead of maximizing space by having them so densely planted, I wanted to make sure I got good air movement around each tomato plant, so I reduced the disease issue with that. Because we even pull out lower, they call them suckers, or between, there's a growing point where they'll shoot out more branches, and we thin them out at the base so that they have more air movement at the base. And we stake them or we put them in cages. We don't want them to grow on the ground because of the disease issues with them as well. So we can get intensive with some vegetables, but we always have some vegetables that we want to make sure that they're getting good air movement around them, so we don't have disease issues. So know what vegetables you're growing and what their issues is. That's why I'm going to highlight some next week, is what we have to worry about pest-wise. And yeah, I'll wait, save that for next week. So that's where we're doing some intensive planning when it looks like that. And this is just showing you different vegetables. If you're just trying to have green onions, you know, you're just going to use the tops, you know, eat them in your vegetables. You can have 100 per square foot. But if I want a sandwich onion, one that I can slice and use on my sandwich, I only can have 9 per square foot, so, and this is that band planting where you're getting pretty intensive at these numbers. So depending on what we're growing, a muskmelon, 1 per square foot, I'm vertical gardening with that. I'm using a smaller cultivar that doesn't get that big because, I pulled this off a produced publication and they're saying for a muskmelon, which tends the vine and take up some space, they're saying 1 per square foot. That means the vine is going to be sharing space with some other vegetables. So you just want to think about that. And again, this is another one that watermelon diseases can be an issue. I like a watermelon, says a dwarf cultivar 1 per square foot. A real watermelon cultivar, when they grow them, they give them a lot of space because the vines will take over an area, and you need to keep those vines not on top of each other because then you get disease issues. So that's just giving you some indication. So like radishes, 144 we could plant per square foot. I'm not sure why you would do that many. I'm pulling it off my research publication, so that's why I got on this PowerPoint, but I wouldn't put that many radishes in a square foot myself. But they don't take up a lot of space, is all I'm saying. So if we're going to do that intensive planting, that's the minimum we need space per plant, And green beans can grow, if you get pole beans that can grow vertically, and you can get a lot of production and keep them picked in that area, extend longer than bush beans, so you can get more productivity. And you can do things like, they focus. So you can make poles that make a teepee, and you can plant your pole beans on that. And if you have grandchildren or children, they can go play in your pole bean tent. So you can have fun with this. We don't have to be boring. So preparing the soil. So tillage is a great way to work in nutrients, and until you get good soil health, it's a good way to get your soil prepared for planting. We don't want to turn it into powder, remember. We don't want to overtill a really dry soil and create powder because that will crust over after you plant into it. So we want to keep our good soil viability as we're preparing the soil. Amendments, whether you're making a raised bed or not. I remember the victory garden, that bearded guy, I actually got a master gardener got him to sign one of his photos to me. But before he started any bed, what did he do? He put compost out there and worked in compost into the beds to add that active organic matter each time. So that's a great way to keep life in your soil. The worst thing is when our organic matter level gets down to the broken down, the humus part that's not as biologically active, because that's when our microorganisms get stagnant in our soil. And then, of course, when we work it, if you work it too wet, you'll just destroy your soil structure. You'll make a compacted layer. You want it where it's moist when you work it. If you work it too dry, you tend to destroy structure as well. So we want to work it when it's moist. And then we will level it out. We don't want to have in our garden areas where it's kind of clumpy, which will happen if you work it too wet, because we want when we plant the seed into the soil, we want it to be soil around the seed and not any oxygen pockets. Then we want to use twine, and you can plant radishes at the end of each row if you want to have an organic way to mark your rows. Then they'll come up before the other plants will, so that's one thing you can do. And how many ever watched the movie? It's Secondhand Lion or whatever that title is, and all they had was sweet corn, but they marked it with different things. You want to make sure you know what you're planting. I guess is my point there. And then we want to make a proper furrow depth for the seed we're planting. And good rule of thumb is, the fine seed you want to just lay on top of the soil just a little bit and cover it with something like vermiculite or compost so it can germinate through it. Larger seeds, it's no more than 3 times the size of the seed when you plant. And then we can take advantage of raised beds, and if you have a fine area, you can create this little drainage area here. I have a picture of, they make all these raised beds that they plant into, and then these nice walkways in between, and there's a chair as if they get us sit in that chair and relax all the time. I did put that picture in, so we can do, and then we can amend that soil as needed as we create some raised beds. How many of you start seeds at home? Christina, tell them how you start your seeds at home.
So I get itching for planting in February and January. I actually winter sow my seeds. So I start sowing seeds from December through March, outside. I don't have the space in my house, so I stick it outside. Not all seeds can be winter sown, so there is kind of a process on what you can sow outside and when. So you could winter sow tomatoes, probably early March, but you wouldn't start them in January because they wouldn't make it. So I winter sowed these. This is just lettuce. And I don't know if you guys go to Kroger, you're running late home, getting some dinner. This is a fried chicken container from Kroger. So you make yourself a little greenhouse, put your seeds in, take them outside, make sure there's holes in the top, and you leave them alone. It's my favorite lazy way of sowing seeds, especially since I don't have room inside. So I winter sow, it's on my front deck on the south side of my house. The only thing you really want to make sure is that your soil inside your little greenhouse, which could be a seed plug tray with a lid on, it could be a milk jug. It doesn't have to be a perfectly clear container. People use totes with, a clear opaque container, and just keep the soil moist. Now, it could take a while. It'll probably take longer to germinate than what the seed packet says, and it's okay. So this is tough love sowing seeds, but it is very rewarding, especially when you really don't put a whole lot of effort into it. I winter sowed bok choy. I did lettuce. I have Swiss chard here, and they're actually rainbow Swiss chard. What else? Choy. I started my peas way early, and I just left those suckers outside because they can handle the cold. But I have done a whole variety of stuff, and I kind of just change it around every year because I want something new and fun. But if you're really, really itching to get something started real early, check out winter sowing. There's tons of publications. I think University of Illinois actually has an extension publication about it. So that's how it's my favorite way of sowing seeds. It's outside. Surprisingly enough, there's plenty of sunlight, even in February, so that your seeds don't stretch.
So if you do it inside, you want to start them based upon how long they germinate and how long you want to grow them before you plant them outside. Because you don't want to hold them too long inside because they can get leggy and unhealthy. You got to provide them supplemental light because once they germinate, you do not want them stretching for light. So you need a grow light or fluorescent light fairly close to them so that they grow well before you transplant them outside. And then if you grow them inside or in a greenhouse, you need to harden them off. So if you buy a flat of tomato plants out of a greenhouse, remember, it's not the environment you're planning to plant them into. So you need to give them time to get acclimated to being outside where there's wind and temperature variation from a day to night. So you want to put them out and let them get used to that, bring them in at night for a few days before you actually transplant them outside, if they're coming out of a protected environment. Christina, tough love.
Tough love.
They're used to being outside
Yes.
already, so she could just move them right into her garden space, and they get direct sunlight or good, or at least decent light.
Yeah, they'll get at least parts of it.
So that they're not going to get as leggy, but like lettuce, I mean, it's a cold season crop, so once it's germinating and growing, this can obviously been even transplanted before this. And then you
You
know,
can munch on it.
Yeah.
Put them outside, yeah.
well, sure. And
I'll
you
bring
just-
that inside and just put it in, because now it's probably gonna get too warm. Don't want it cold.
Yeah, well, this weather's not normal for me.
So is it too late right now to see?
No, that's I mean, if you, I mean, our soil temperatures are warm now, so it's not as needed, because we're an odd year where our soil temperatures go to really warm up this week. and it's time to plant them anyway, so you could get by with direct seeding now, just because of the calendar and our local calendar. Most Mays, sometimes Mays are just as cool as April, so if we're in one of those, Mays, then starting them inside to give them a head start would still make sense. But so you'd be doing this back in March, timeframe, starting seeds for planting, in the beginning of May, to give them time to get germinated and start growing. And depending on the different cultivars, different vegetables you grow, you start them at different times based upon when you always start when you want to plant them and you backtrack it to when you start the seed so that it's germinated and you got a seedling that's growing that has some root mass to transplant the goal. So, but you can try it now. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with doing it. You know, I always tell master gardeners, you're gardeners. You're not trying to make a living out of gardening. Do fun things. Oh my gosh. I mean, so, you know, don't limit yourself. Have fun. So then when we're seeding, we want to, number one, plant them at the proper spacing, allowing for maybe some thinning. Make sure you have enough, so whatever it says on the packet, you may want to scrunch it up a little bit because they should have a high percent germ based upon their preparation, but you would just figure it's probably no better than 90% of them are going to germinate, so you want to do the proper spacing, but make sure you space them close enough together. If one doesn't take, it's no big deal. Then you always can thin the other ones if need be. But, a pea's a different, a definite size, good size seed. So it can go, maybe twice the size of the seed down into that soil because it has the energy to germinate and pop through. But broadleaves aren't as designed as well to deal with popping through as would a grass is like sweet corn, because a sweet corn makes a little spike that actually pushes through where broadleaves have to kind of just pop through. So we never want that crusting situation. That's why we never want a fine powdered soil we're planting into. We want to maintain good soil structure so that it doesn't crust over. So finer seeds, what you can do is this was started. This one started off of a tape.
Yes.
So you can actually buy your seeds on a tape that's already properly spaced that you just plant the tape. Or you use a container so you can gradually just let them feed out. Because if I'm dealing with tiny seeds, you can't plant like peas. So you need to have a system so that you don't dump a bunch at one spot. You want to kind of just have them come out. So even putting them in a piece of paper and just managing how few will pop out can work. But then with the fine seeds, definitely you want to put compost or vermiculate on top so they're not going to crust over because you just want to cover the seeds basically after you plant them. Does that make sense? Because they're tiny, so they don't have a huge energy source to get started. So it's not complicated, but if you're planting carrots, chances are you're going to have to thin them because the best you try to do the proper spacing, it's not going to happen because they're tiny seeds. As you're going, or I do it with my fingers, just kind of let a couple drop out and let it down the row. And then you can come back and thin. It's okay to thin. You can wash those and have a quick snack if you want. But when you want a decent sized carrot, you gotta give them the proper space so that they can become a larger carrot.
Is there a trick to carrots to get them to sprout?
They don't need much cover and plant them on the soil conditions are good for them. Okay. And I'm sure you do that with it.
I've never been able to get any carrots to sprout.
Then start them in a container and transplant them. You can transplant carrots. Start them inside in a box, a petri, container like this.
Yeah.
And just start, or even you can even do a peat pot and start it in that. So once they germinate and start growing, you can just pop that in the ground, or you can create your own pot. I have a vendor that uses paper to make the pots. But anyways, you want to be able just to plant that into the soil, then once it's up and growing, you let it get a little size before you transplant it. Then you don't have to thin it, so you have advantages, so you can try it both ways. Let's see what works.
So it's strong enough to poke a hole in that bottom for the root carrot to get bigger.
Well, you want to just plant it into a soil.
Do what?
So,
What's next?
so I don't think a carrot would pop out of these real well, you know, so that, like this. So I'd almost use a pea pod or something like that, just so I could plant that, I could pull the edges off the top and I don't have to mess with that little root. There's different ways, different things we could use to start our seeds there. We could use pea pods. They make these jiffy, they look like pellets, but you add moisture to them and then you can plant into that and you plant that into the soil. So those, you don't have to pop out the container. Or you could use plastic trays and just cut off the plastic trays so you're not popping them out of the root system. So you're just going to want to think how you can least disturb the roots as you're planting it. Now this one, you're just going to have to pop it out of there.
There's
And
soft
then,
on the bottom. You really can't stick your finger to the bottom of these.
like that, and it came out. And look at those beautiful root system that's on that. So we got a healthy plant here to transplant into our garden space. White roots are healthy roots. If they're ever brown or gall color, that's a disease root that's bad. So white roots mean they're actively growing. And then, so then we can just make the size of hole that this will fit into nicely and firm it around the plant, because we do not want air around the roots. Air around roots that we plant is a dead root. I mean, they need to be in soil, and then needs to be, we can water them in to make sure we get those fine air pockets out of there. And as you transplant bigger, vegetables like my boxcar willie, I was going to bring in the bigger holes, so it's more likely to have air pockets. So you make bigger holes. For this one, I would just take a trowel and spread it apart and slide it in and slide it back together. And then I would then water it in with starter fertilizer and not a very following label directions, because if you use too strong of a starter fertilizer, you kill it. So you just want the right amount of starter fertilizer in the water mix. Fertilizer or salts. So too much salt will kill roots, so that's why you want to be real careful with fertilizer. When I don't read directions, I kill plants, so follow my bad example. Don't follow my bad example and read directions, because it just takes a little starter fertilizer. If you have a good soil that you're planting into, and that's where building your soil, you won't need much, but having a little phosphorus does help the roots to take off. So look at these tomato plants, okay? Which one would you pick? You pick. Which tomato transplant do you want to buy?
I want the one on the right.
Yes. Because it's got, this one looks like it was stretching for sunlight. And if you go to some stores, have you ever seen how they ship them in? Some get stuck on the next level down and they're not getting as much light. So even though they start out well in a greenhouse, they're struggling now when they're on site before someone buys them. And then someone growing tomatoes to sell as transplants, he made his own greenhouse, is heating it with coal, because in Davis County, coal is almost free if you want to use the heat source, the real cheap in their market. And but the trouble is, he got dust in between the two layers of plastic. So above his bedding plants, there was no light. So they were growing straight towards the sidewalls, and they were stretching like, "Give me some light!" You don't buy those plants. If you buy a tomato plant in a gallon or a 2-gallon size container that's meant to be large and starting to fruit and produce fruit, vegetables on it, that's okay. But if one of these has a tomato on it, it's dying, because all plants want to reproduce. So if they're really sick, they go right to reproduction and try to reproduce themselves. So it's not cute on a plant that's in a small pot to have a tomato on it. You don't buy those. If it's stretching, you don't buy those. If they have disease, you don't want to buy those. In fact, it was from, nothing against them, a disease just got into their plants and they were selling them through some of the larger stores. So you bought a disease that killed tomato plants. That happened with drugs. So you want to make sure they don't have lesions on it when you buy it. So you want to buy a healthy plant that's got a sturdy stalk to it, has a healthy root system. I pop them out of the container and I look, make sure they got good roots. And then then you got a good start to your plants. Make the proper size hole based upon just a little bit bigger than what it is. Then you firm the soil back around. This is just talking about what I already talked about, popping them out. If you have a peat pot, you want to make sure you take the top part off of it because it acts like a wick. That'll dry the plant out, because it takes the moisture out of the soil. But the rest of it will rot, so that's why you don't have to remove the bottom. And then you need to water them in. Make sure you get rid of the air pockets. And you can add some standard fertilizer as you water them in. This is side dressing off to the right. That's what they're doing with the fertilizer here. And you still want to make sure you follow label directions and don't over fertilize in your side dressing. Traditional gardening. We have what we have. We have the proper row spacing. We can use our rototiller or a hoe to pick out the weeds in between. And we still need to make sure the plants are properly spaced within the row so they're not competing within the row, that they have the space that they need. And that packet will tell you how to traditionally plant your vegetable. But more intensive gardening. So we're in this, it may take more labor because we want to manage our plants to make sure they're getting the space they need. And we're pulling weeds because we're not going to be using a hoe when they're planted together. You can see they're utilizing structure, so we can do some vertical gardening. Some ways that we can intensify and we can interplant. So we have chard and we have some looks like carrots planted in among that to take advantage of that space so that we're not wasting space by interplanting different vegetables together. So that's how we can intensify our gardening. And we can do succession planting. So we can grow our warm season crop first and followed by a cool season fall crop. So you can use the same space twice. Or it could be the reverse. It could be the first crop is a cool season crop like peas, then you follow it with another vegetable crop in that space. Because right now, this week, if you got peas, they're not setting, the flowers are not going to be producing anything this week because it's too hot. Anything above 70 to 75 degrees will stop the pea flower from pollinating. So relay planting, the concept here is we got the same vegetable, but we're planting it at different times. So we have different harvest times in our garden space. So we extend the period that we're harvesting. Or we can plant the same vegetable, but different cultivars. We can do like an early girl and a better boy, because they'll have different times to harvest. So we plant at the same time, but they will produce vegetables at different times. And tomatoes, because there's a disease for every season. My idea of relay planting with tomatoes is planting some early and some later, so that I keep getting tomatoes. And the earlier ones I plant, when they get diseased, I yank them out of my garden and rely on my next crop of tomato plants. So that's how you can manage disease in some vegetables as well. With sweet corn, you want to make sure that where field corn's growing, that you are a shorter season crop so that you don't cross-pollinate with field corn because you're eating the seed. So sweet corn cross-pollinated with field corn is not sweet. Let's put it that simple. And you can grow 2 cultivars of sweet corn and and then you adjust either the planting date or the maturity days to harvest in those 2 different cultivars if you want to try different sweet corns. That's how you prevent them from cross-pollinating. It's making sure they don't have the nick at the same time when the pollen's being produced. And then vertical garden, we can use, you can be creative and make this as attractive as you want vertical gardening. Here they're using bamboo, again with pole beans, and then we've got some cucumbers growing on a panel that they can take advantage of them growing up on it. So then you can have a cucumber with just a square foot or a dwarf, that's binding, and take advantage of the vertical gardening for the, as it vines to grow up on that. And then the plant's getting all the nutrients it needs below that panel. So it's a way that you can increase your space to grow more vegetables you may not have space for when you go to vertical gardening. So that's cool. Or you can do your box on the side of that shed that gets good sun for at least half of the day and do real vertical gardening and grow stuff there. If you do that with, this is vegetables, but you can do day neutral strawberries and be picking off that in the spring and the fall and have strawberries twice a year. And then this is another intensive concept called companion gardening. And what the goal here is creating biodiversity. So we have flowers that are attracting pollinators. We even have herbs out here that can have some beneficial effects on reducing pests as well. Plus then you got the herb to harvest. And then we can grow different vegetables in the same plant family. So then we rotate in a companion garden, we rotate that type of vegetable grouping to a new site. And that's how we do rotation. But pretty research shows biodiversity works. You confuse pests because it's not one crop and you have less pest problems. We've done that research. So this biodiversity does help reduce pest problems by creating that biodiversity. So when we're doing this kind of planting, we think about botanical families that we rotate. Feeding families, we make sure that what we're planting has similar nutrient needs, pH, and how we fertilize. And then we rotate performance families to different sites, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then there's pest fighting families that we have plants planted together will reduce some pest issues. So, we're thinking, we have the aster family. That would be one family that you keep together when you're doing this botanical planting. Get a cabbage family, and when we talk about changing plants, a lot of these in this plant came from the original same plant, but just selection over time we created different vegetables. Did you know that? So these are really close cousins because their heritage goes back to some of them to the same plant. Carrot family, sweet corn is the main thing we grow. Though there's other grasses you could grow. And then this is legumes. Remember, they fix nitrogen, so they help build the soil. So that's a whole different category of the nutrients that they pull out of the soil. And then the onion family, it helps repel some pests. So that's one you may want to work in with some other plants just for that plant benefit aspect of it. And then we have the perennial asparagus in that grouping. Spinach family, so beet, spinach, Swiss chard. So that's a different family. And then we got the squashes. And the biggest issues with these, again, is disease. So that one we want to be careful how much we plant close together, because the less air movement around those creates more issues with disease. So some of these we can do vertical gardening with. And then the nightshade family, which is eggplants, peppers, potatoes, and tomatoes. I always thought as a brave person that ate the first tomatoes, because most of the fruit on these is toxic. Even on the potatoes, the fruit is toxic. So the first person that ate a tomato, I always think he was awfully hungry. So then performance families. So just think about this for a second. So we got the heavy feeders, the corns, the cucumbers, the eggplants, melons, peppers, pumpkins, tomatoes, and squashes. So when we do our crop rotation, we don't want to rotate corn in behind where we grew our tomato plants because they're both are heavy feeders. So you don't want to do that twice. Then we have moderate feeders that are the cabbages, the cauliflowers, and lettuce and kale. So that could be a good crop to follow a heavy feeder. And then we have light feeders that could follow that. And then we have the soil builders that would follow that to build the soil back up before you rotate back to a heavy feeder. And if you're really loving your soil, you have a fallow period in your garden space too, where one season you just grow, just have it in a cover crop that has legumes in it to build your soil. You may not have that space, but you can use compost to amend these to help with the heavy feeders as well. So adding compost and doing this kind of a rotation with a heavy feeder is followed by a moderate feeder, then a light feeder, then a soil builder is one way we can keep our soils productive and have that active carbon in there and the nutrient level high to grow our vegetables. Does that make sense? So when it's not just moving tomatoes here and then sweet corn there. Well, those are both heavy feeders. We want to follow that heavy feeder with a moderate feeder. So you want to be changing up your garden space with vegetables that pull nutrients out at different levels so we can maintain soil fertility and biological activity. That's our goal. A healthy soil is a definition of a productive soil, and a nutrient-rich soil is needed to grow our vegetables as well. What's cool is sometimes one crop can help another crop to grow better. A good example, okay, having sweet corn, plant your lettuce, and then your sweet corn close to it. And as your sweet corn starts growing, it can extend the season for your lettuce by cooling it as it gets warmer. Because you're not going to plant the sweet corn until it gets warmer. And your lettuce, you'll start when it's still cool, but you can keep the productivity of that area going a little bit longer by having that shading effect occurring in that space. And you can even do some interplanting if you plant your lettuce early enough where you plant your sweet corn close to it, and not have it that far away. This is everyone's heard of this, haven't you? The Three Sisters. This is a classical way where planting three plants together help. Because how many have heard of raccoons? How many have heard of raccoons like sweet corn? So having the squash plant growing around the sweet corn would deter them from getting your sweet corn. Having a soil builder planted by the sweet corn, which grows up on it, which would be like pole beans, and using the corn as its scaffolding to go into the sky, will not only allow the beans to be productive during the growing season, but actually putting some nitrogen, fixing nitrogen into the soil by that sweet corn. And then that's the range for the sweet corn. So you have the vining beans using the sweet corn, feeding the sweet corn, and then the squash protecting the sweet corn. What does the squash get out of this? Space to grow. We give it space to grow, but it's protecting the sweet corn. So this is a concept. So you got the sweet corn, the beans are growing up on it, and you got the squash around it to discourage the raccoons. I knew someone once that collected hair from where someone that's cutting hair. You'd ask him to back up all this hair. He put it all the way around his garden space to deter raccoons from going in there, and they were not deterred. He left all that work. So we got to think of a better plan than that. But in this companion planting, in this band planting, we still want to remember we need to give each plant the space that it needs, right? Between the corn and beans, that's 5 feet, 8 feet, and in between there we're growing the squash, which will vine out beyond the sweet corn when it gets established. So we need to still give the plants the space that it needs so they're not competing too much. Always want to give your plants the space that they need. And you can experiment with that, your gardeners. If you want to try it closer together, try it, see what happens. In your same garden space, have them at the proper space and see how the yield is. Is it better or lower? I can't believe at 60,000 sweet corn plants per acre, he actually boosts his yield in his research trial up in Michigan. So until we try it, we don't know. So this is actually proven that if you plant a bean row and then a potato row, you'll confuse the Colorado potato beetle, which feeds on the potatoes, and the Mexican bean beetles, which feed on the beans. So research has shown it reduce your pests by putting your beans in between your potato rows and vice versa. So then we have trap crops. I already told you the magical one for Japanese beetles, it actually is a weed. So you do have weeds out there that insects will prefer to feed on in a trap crop. But the Colorado potato beetles like eggplants. So if you have eggplants there, you may reduce their feeding on your potatoes. And flea beetles and cabbage maggots like radishes. And flea beetles is the main insect pest of eggplants. So if we plant plants that help with them reducing the feeding on the plants that we want to harvest, that can be a way to reduce the pest damage and creating biodiversity. The onion family will repair the carrot rust flies, again, Colorado potato beetles and Japanese beetles and aphids. So onions have a value to help reduce pests on other vegetables as well. So interplanting can have a benefit. So there you go, companion planting. This is in this case, it's the Solenesis or the nightshade family plants. We got peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, but then we got some straw flowers and parsley and coriander and flowers. We just had a meeting for the master gardeners talking about making ointments to put on for healing. So you'd have one you can harvest for that out of this grouping. So you can utilize your herbs as well as your vegetable plants, and then flowers help attract in some beneficial insects to control other insect pests. So biodiversity can be a fun thing to do and a productive thing to do as long as we make sure that each plant gets the space it needs in that planting. So initially, they don't look all together. When you plant them, of course, they grow together and you don't want them competing too much. Does this make sense? So this is kind of a natural way to reduce pests, confuse the insects, and have fun. You can do the traditional method as well. How you want to garden, that's up to you. You're the gardeners. You don't have to answer to Bob Yoder. Just do what you want to do. So another thing we can do is instead of using binding cucumbers, we can use a gourd or a bush. And we're talking about growing in containers on the last session. This is a good tool to use for container gardening, is having a plant that's not going to be as aggressive growing as other cultivars of that plant, because you'll still get cucumbers, probably not as many as a binding one, of course, but it's a way that we can manage those in a more tight space. This is just a brief note. If you just have a small garden, you can help with community garden. We have one at the neighborhood center. You can harvest some vegetables if you help at their garden too. So community garden is another way that you can volunteer and get some vegetables out of it as well. In some communities I've lived in, they actually have areas that they will give everyone a certain space to get the garden. We really don't have one of those. But that's a way that you can help citizens to grow their own vegetables and have fun interacting with other gardeners as well. So then, when we're looking at cool season, this group of plants can be either planted in now, they should be already planted and growing now, or you can plant them for a fall garden and you start them actually in the summer months for the fall garden. But you plant broccoli in the summer, you don't want to do it. It looks ugly. It needs a cool season for the flowers to form properly. So we again, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and cauliflower, they're closely related actually. So they're cool season plants that we need to plant early according to the planting calendar for cool season kohlrabi. How many like kohlrabi? It's a different tasting vegetable, but it's good. that lettuce, we should have this out in the garden now.
I'm gonna eat it. I'm gonna take that inside and eat it.
You're gonna eat it.
I'm just gonna eat it. I do my lettuces like this so I can leave them inside. Last year I had caterpillars eat all my lettuce. So
That's fine.
sniffing.
So we have Titus Overhaul too that sells at our farmer's market, has a cultivar of lettuce that can tolerate the warmer temperatures that he's found. So you can keep growing it into the summer months. So it can be extended into the warmer months if you have the right cultivar. Of course, peas, because we had that issue this week that they're not going to pollinate to produce new pods. And then potatoes and radishes and spinach. So of all these vegetables, which one likes the lowest pH?
Potato?
Potatoes. Due to disease issues, they actually recommend to plant those at a 5.5 pH. So that makes it hard to rotate those to garden sites if you got to change the pH that much. So you want to think about how you can work that one into a rotation. Some of these are very cold hardy. Spinach is, for example, it will. Lettuce, you got to make sure you start it early enough if you want to fall garden lettuce because it won't be productive once it cools off too much. Spinach can tolerate cold and stay productive later into the fall months. But we'll talk about that next week. So you can plant these fairly quickly as soon as you have good conditions to plant into to get them going. Planting potatoes, just remember that I've seen a potato where they planted them and then the seed potato that was planted just sat there and wire worms and seed cord magnets found it. So so what you don't want to do is where you plant early is working a lot of organic matter because as that organic matter decays, and I mean fresh organic matter, like cover crops and stuff. So where you plant potatoes, it'd be better to have like rye, cereal rye that you lay down and don't work into the soil, and then plant your potatoes into that. And then as the plant grows, it's going to have that control, help control the weeds. Because if you work a lot of green matter into the soil, you can attract seed cord magnets that the does form out. And lining stuff is like sign the seed cord magnets. So it was a weird year that year. It doesn't normally happen. The weird year where it's so cool, the soil when they planted it, the potato really didn't develop and get off to a good start. Because usually there's enough for insects to eat and you still have a potato plant. So that's just an odd year. So I don't want to worry you, but it was not a good day for that gardener when I visited him. And then we need to wait till after Mother's Day to plant. We can get a head start on these by starting them inside and transplanting outside. So you already have a plant up and growing when you plant, but you can wait and plant the seeds outdoors. Pumpkins, there's a virus that attacks them that actually is less likely to happen if you plant them late. So that's a good one to plant by seed versus starting a plant. Things like sweet potatoes, we do starts anyway. So if you take a sweet potato and you get it to sprout, and it's those that we plant. So it's already up and growing before you plant those. Sweet corn, the secret to farmers markets, if you want to make money on sweet corn, is you start them and then you transplant them outside and you get sweet corn before anybody else does. So you can try that. Start some sweet corn inside and plant it once it's past Mother's Day, so you get sweet corn early. But you can just plant that in the ground and get it. And as it'll germinate once the soil is warmer. So soil temperatures is important to planting these. Soil temperature around 50 is good for sweet corn. Beans, and some of these would actually prefer it closer to 60 degrees. So you won't wait till your soil warms up if you're planting a seed. So like cucumbers and melons and some squashes, you can get a head start in the growing season by starting plants. Others you can just direct seed Peppers, of course, and tomatoes, it's better to plant the seedling, get that plant off to a good start, instead of waiting that tiny seed to germinate and grow outside. So, so different vegetables, we usually handle them in a different way to get off to a good start. And my commercial growers, they already got their seedlings ready to plant. They haven't planted them yet, because once they plant by seed, would be more like the radishes and some beets, but having Swiss chard off to a good start makes sense, because then you can transplant it and get it going. That's just reminding you, you have to wait till it's warm to plant the warm season. And then there's things like Swiss chard, onions, carrots, beets that we can start earlier, or they can tolerate the warmer weather as when we plant them if we wait till we plant the warm season vegetables. So we do have some that tolerate. I grew beets once for my sheep as a research project for Purdue University. There were huge beets. And I'll tell you how much sheep like beets. They ate all the pigweed before they ate the beets, and then they ate that green top. And after they ate that, then they started eating the actual beet. So they gained weight, so the research trial was a success. They did well on the beets, but they didn't like it. But beets are very healthy for them and us too, right? So that's a great vegetable to grow for your health. It's 7:30. These are the perennial vegetables we tend to have in our garden space. I call these plants you can put in an edible landscape. I made my daughter upset because I planted rhubarb in where is a shade garden, but on the edges there was a lot of sun, so I planted some rhubarb there. She didn't think that belonged, but I think rhubarb is attractive as a foliage myself. And just remember that we need to give these plants time to get established before we start harvesting. A couple of years, you can do some light harvest on the asparagus before that. And how do we know when to start harvesting asparagus? Is when the stem tissue starts getting a smaller diameter. It needs to be the size, like my finger here, when we're harvesting it. And when it gets really start getting smaller, it's time to let the plant to go ahead and develop and replenish the carbohydrates in the plant. Rhubarb is similar, you can do some harvesting into June once they're established, then you want to let them rest after that. We need to let the ferns take over for the asparagus, and to me, that's attractive. Is that ugly to you, that picture? I think they kind of look cool. That's why I think it could fit into an edible landscape. And that even gives winter interest to your garden or your landscape if you just let them stay up during the winter months. So it's something that can be attractive. And then you remove them before they start sprouting the next spring. Or once they turn brown in the fall, you can cut them off then. And you never want to see this on a rhubarb plant because that's stealing nutrients from the plant. So if it bolts, you want to cut that bolt off of your rhubarb plant. And particularly with asparagus, we want to give good phosphorus to them when we're planting them. When we plant, you don't buy seeds. You can start seeds if you wanted to. But the real productive asparagus is actually this male asparagus. It doesn't produce seed. The old cultivars produce seed. But you want to take a 1-year-old crown and plant it about 5 to 6 inches deep and put the soil back on top of it. But also in that row, that slot, you want to put in some phosphorus to make sure it has plenty of phosphorus to develop the root system. And at Purdue University, we have publications on a lot of these vegetables that go into detail on them. So that's something I didn't make multiple copies because I don't know how many to grow rhubarb. Drainage is important for both of these, particularly rhubarb. If you have a site that's wet for rhubarb, the crown may get disease and die. So it needs to be well drained to plant rhubarb. And once it's established, you got perennial spread, in that sun. So having a perennial garden
for these rhubarb and asparagus. It's a great way, once they're established, they get a nice treat every spring up into early summer. So any questions about those? What's cool is you can buy your asparagus and your rhubarb right here in Marshall County. You just gotta drive up Michigan Road and go to Indiana Berry because they sell it. So we have those perennial, and they got horseradish too, which I'm gonna talk about. You want some spicy, you gotta have some horseradish.